Hello, Mr. Mario Ramos-Reyes.
How are you doing?
I'm doing fine. Thank you for agreeing to talk with me today. We're going to talk about the subject of Christian democracy in Latin America because I run this site about Christian democracy, which has about 1,000 viewers. And they asked me, what can you tell me about Christian democracy in Latin America? And I was like, I really don't know that much. Let's find someone. Because I'm based in Sweden, in northern part of Europe. And then I found you. And I know that you have been active in Paraguay and now you live in America. Please tell me a little bit about yourself.
Well, indeed, I was born in Asunción, Paraguay, many years ago. And I studied law first, and then I studied philosophy. And I went to the Catholic University in Asunción, so I got my degree in both. That was more or less in the 80s, late 80s. And so during this time, Paraguay was living under strong dictatorship, which started in 1950s and lasted almost 40 years. The dictator was deposed in 1989. And so, and the political context was very, very complicated, to say the least. It was repression, persecution. And so by then, during this time, I was very close to what was then the Christian Democratic Party, even though it was illegal then. The dictator never recognized as a political party, but there was a movement, and I was part of that movement, social Christian movement. And after the dictator was deposed, I decided to continue my studies and finish a master. There were no program masters at that point in Paraguay because the dictator controlled everything. So I came to the United States and finished my degree in philosophy, a PhD, and a master's degree. And so that was in the 90s. But always my research was around the political philosophy and history of ideas, and mainly Christian Democrat ideas of social Christian movement in France in 19th century, 20th century, and in Latin America in general. So my formation was originally quite based on Aristotle and Aquinas. So I wrote my dissertation on the long process of adoption Christian democratic ideas in Latin America between the early 20th century and the 1960s. And so, and I took as a model the intellectual strength of Jacques Maritain, how he influenced presidents like Rafael Caldera and Eduardo Frei. So that is pretty much my
long life history. Up to now.
Yeah, up to now, yeah.
At least the academical part of it, because life is so much more. But yes. To talk about Christian democracy in Latin America, that would be also to say, like, how about Christian democracy in Europe? I mean, there are different countries and they're all influenced by different culture in some way. But would you say that there is a more particular type in Latin America that differs from Europe in any way? And what would that be?
It's a good question. If you take a look carefully, the sources from which the social Christian movement in Latin America was coming from, is almost identical to the sources where in Europe, Christian democratic parties were coming from. The same ideas, the same principles. So given the fact that Latin America was mainly, I'm talking about 19th century and early 20th century, shaped by at least one layer, so to speak, of the culture by the Catholic tradition. And in Europe at that point also had have an influence from that tradition. So the principles are pretty much the same. So much so that just one example, the young intellectual in 1930s, Eduardo Frei, who later became the president of Chile in the 60s, he was a militant of a conservative party first, and then he was a member also, or at least he was working with Catholic Action in Latin America and then in Chile, and then he traveled to Europe because this big encounter with the Catholic youth in Europe, and then he realized that there was a trend coming from Europe which would renovate, so to speak, the view of conservative politics in Latin America. And so that was pretty much the influence that he got then from the ideas coming from Spain at one point, from France, led by Jacques Maritain. So going back to your original question, yes, there is some details perhaps that show the differences between the two continents. But basically, I think the source is almost the same.
I find that because I've been trying to learn more about Christian democracy for the last 3 years, the time being that I've been employed by the Christian Democratic Party. And I often find that the sources about personalism are in Spanish and they are from Latin America. So I would say that the personalistic movement has very much been carried up in Latin America. And talking about Jacques Maritain, how about the influence on politics of his ideas?
Well, I think you're saying correctly the idea or the movement of personalism began taking root in Europe between, let's say, the end of First World War and the beginning of the Second World War. And one of the leading intellectuals was Maritain. There were others. He was not the only one. And yet, we can credit him for proposing the term personalism, and which means that perspective, philosophical perspective, which when I say philosophical perspective, I'm not referring only to some speculative way of understanding reality. I'm not talking about ethics exclusively. I'm not talking about aesthetics, even though he talked and he wrote about all these topics. We're talking about here a view that can be implemented into the real world, where the model, if you will, or the proposal might be distant from the prevalent ideology of the time, such as the rise of fascism in Italy and also in Germany a little bit later. And also remember the 1920s, the crack of Wall Street make it impossible for some intellectuals to start thinking about the rise of capitalism or the liberal capitalism of that time. So the idea was that there was one reality which was completely out of the picture, and this ideology was the human person. But now the human person, or the meaning that Maritain wanted to give, is very, very profound, because the human person is not just the individual, it's not just the substance as some ancient philosopher, even Aristotle would suggest. The human person is human person only if it is in relationship to another. So human person is only an individual of encounter. So in other words, the category of relations in Maritain view is not a category which is an accident like in Aristotle. It's something ontological. In other words, if we are not people of encounter, we are not persons. Now, if that then is the case, we need to propose, it's a hypothesis, a society where the human person takes primacy. And the way by which we do that is by taking primacy of the common good. From there, he starts proposing and fleshing out different aspects of this, what he may be calling in some ways, a new civilization, a new way of understanding the civitas, the citizen. And that was a game changer, even within the church. Because in 1930s, in the teens and 1930s, in France, there was support in some area of the church, let's say the idea that maybe bring back the old regime against the liberalism that was seen as completely anti-Catholic. So there is a very complicated issues there. And so Maritain began fleshing out this new way of looking at things. And then, of course, I think the Luigi Sturzo in Italy a little bit before him. And then you can add, I think, an extraordinary figure of the French personalists like Emmanuel Mounier, which is more concrete, more it's an activist. Maritain was perhaps more reluctant to get into the daily practice of politics. He was more, I think, what he says, an agitator, but an agitator of ideas.
And this concept of person being in relation to other people, what effect does that has that had on the Christian democratic parties of Latin America, the kind of policies or the kind of ideas that are at the center of their politic?
Well, when you read the history of Latin America, you will see there are trends. And to make a long story short, that trend, which one came from, of course, the process of the evangelization that came from Spain, the Spanish Empire. And so that evangelization penetrated the culture in general, particularly people, not only what we may call, it's a very loosely way of calling the middle class, but also the peasantry and the workers. So there was a sense of Catholicism, and you can see, or you could see in gestures, pilgrimages, way in which people have what we call popular religiosity, which is very common in Latin America. That was due to the evangelization, and you can cite very eras during this process. Well, the Jesuit missions and many other ways, as the Franciscan also evangelized. So that gave the culture a view that favor in the 19th century, after the independence movement, a more, let's say, conservative view of reality. In other words, don't change this because that is part of our patrimony. And the patrimony we owe to the Catholic Church. There's no question about that. But at the same time, there was another tradition which was on a collision course with this, which began in the 19th century, which began in some ways with the independence movement. But, and I wrote about this, you trace back to even earlier time, in colonial time, which was a more liberal way of understanding reality in Latin America. You need to keep in mind the 19th century Latin America was influenced heavily by French agnostic way of thinking. Auguste Comte, the great philosopher who created the system of positivism, was his idea were implemented in Mexico. Remember the government of the scientists in Mexico around 1870s. You find this in Brazil. The seal of Brazil says "Orden e Progreso," which is the motto of positivism. So right there in the 19th century, you have two layers. One, which is strictly Catholic, more conservative, and then another, which was more progressive, so to speak, and more liberal, agnostic. And they were completely separated, and they see each other as enemies. So you can explain there why then there has been so many confrontation, even violent confrontation. And then either the conservative, so to speak, is a very broad term, or the liberal trusted not as much in institution in order to implement their ideas, rather than on strong leaders, what we call caudillos. So you have these two trends, and I always cite the expression of a Chilean intellectual and politician, Lastarria, which says something, well, on the one hand, there was the old past based on the crown and the conquest and the Catholicism, and on the other, the liberal democracy, which is coming into our time. And so, but the problem was that there is no middle point, or there's no way to reconcile both. So there was, and when I expressed this, there was an schizophrenia. And the schizophrenia needs something with which that schizophrenia can be healed, can be, make it work and reconcile both extremes, so to speak. And so that was the history of Latin America. Now, my claim, and it's my claim, and I wrote my long dissertation on this, is that view that tried to reconcile the Catholic tradition of the people in Latin America with the ideals of liberties, civil liberties, balance of power, participation, and pluralism, we owe to the proposal of Christian Democrat or social Christian. And a figure which is key in understanding these two way of realities that ultimately are reconcilable in one view, I think, is Jacques Maritain and his disciples in Latin America, Rafael Caldera in Venezuela, who one, Amoroso Lima in Brazil was another. Of course, Eduardo Frei and many others in Chile. And so they tried to bring both, so that the Christian democracy, social Christian movement was called a movement, tried to bring both. In other words, don't deny the past that was coming out of the Catholic memory, so to speak. But at the same time, we need a new structures, which is not exclusively authoritarian or conservative, rather an institution that can give us the freedom that we need in order to become a modern liberal democracy with a Christian content.
Would, in the Latin America context, the Christian democracy be considered conservative?
Well, my first answer would be no. And this is what I believe. Now, if you ask today any liberal, extreme, left-wing intellectual, I say, no, they are extreme conservative. But factually, historically, the answer is no. And the answer is no because if you, let's say Chile, the founder, one of the founders, Eduardo Frei, precisely, he left the Conservative Party in order to keep some, what we may call ideas of the formation of the country, which come from the Catholic Church, with the idea of liberal democracy.
Mm-hmm.
And so without going to the other extreme to deny the past and become, let's say, a relativistic or so liberal democracy. So there was a middle position. The same thing you can say, I don't know, Paraguay, the social Christian movement began in the 1960s. And so in Paraguay, there's two traditional political parties, the Colorado Party, which is pretty much influenced, perhaps originally, by some ideas coming from the United States. I don't want to get into that. But in the 1930s, changed into a more fascist or nationalistic, extremely statist political party, and the Liberal Party, which also holds some ideas which are not precisely the ideas of Christian ideas of the colonial past, so to speak, even though there are some eclecticism. But then you have the social Christian movement and then the Christian Democratic Party trying to reconcile in some way both the Catholic tradition and the ideal of the new way of democratic thinking. So there is an expression, there was an expression at least in the 1960s and 70s to call Christian Democratic Party there. They call red fish in holy water.
Oh, yes.
Red fish, in other words, this word left-winger, but in holy water. So I think are not conservative. And now, if you're saying, well, they are conservative in family value, are conservative in giving primacy to the family, to the human person, well, yes. Now, if you are talking about conservative, whatever one define that word, through the economic policies or the social policies, probably the answer is no.
Has there been a connection between social democrats and Christian democrats in Latin America? And what would the difference be then? Because I've just read up a little bit on it, and I thought perhaps I saw some signs like that.
Well, there is a politician, very, very learned politician in my country. I think now he's a minister, but very well educated. He's a social democrat. And I have known him for many years, and always I remember him saying this: we social democrat are cousins with Christian Democrat. We are not brothers or sisters. We are cousins. And by that is a metaphor. Well, he's saying, well, in some aspects, we coincide in some policies, but in others, we're completely different. And the different, I think, lie basically in what are the foundation of society. What is the human person? Generally, socialists or social democrat come from the Marxist tradition. I'm not talking about the original Marxist tradition, which flourished after the Bolshevik Revolution, but after the Second International, when the Social Democrats start playing the game of liberal democracy, and they open much more to pluralism and all that. So they, in some ways, were doing what also Christian Democrats are doing, playing what is contemporary way of looking at political things. But the source is different. And then, because of that, there are policies, concrete policies, which differ, and because different in foundation. At least, if you look at Christian Democrats who are really faithful to their own root, and Christian Democrats also who are faithful to their own roots. So there are commonalities, if you will, and there are differences. But I do believe there are the commonalities or similarity between these two movements are perhaps closer than you may find between Christian Democrat and, I don't know, liberal libertarians or that sort. So in that sense, there are some similarity. How many alliances between these two movements has been in Latin America? I really don't have exact data. One, perhaps this is very interesting, is that 1958 in Venezuela, after the long dictatorship, there was an agreement, a pact, which is called the Pact of Punto Fijo, where the Christian Democrat and Social Democrat, ADECO and COPEI, agree start building a new modern democratic system in Venezuela. And that lasted until everyone knows, until was declared dead with the eruption in Venezuela, with the dictatorship or the election first of Chavez.
What would you say is the core of Christian democracy?
What I think, or what the Christian Democrats think.
What do you think?
Is Christ.
Yes.
Is Christ. I'm of the view, if Christ, as I see it, is God incarnated. It's not just an intellectual entity, rather than live among us in reality. Then what he proposed must be lived daily. It's not just an idea. It's not just some principle. It's something which is factual. And it's factual, it moves. The word movement comes from that, it moves. So that people who encounter him start moving and doing the things that he did or he taught. Solidarity, help the poor, embrace the stranger. And so from there, you go slowly as a human person with others and start fleshing out what would be the best way to deal with this proposal, so to speak. And then this movement slowly began formulating in very human terms what to do. I'm not saying that exclusively then the Christian democratic movement embrace Christian. No, I'm not saying that. It's not what I'm saying. It's saying, well, because the nature is such that the other is also embraced, then we can embrace a movement which include people from different religious traditions.
Yes, we always say, because Sweden is a highly secularized country and many people do not believe in a God at all, we always say that the ideas stem from the teachings of the Bible and also some that you talked about, Aristotle and so. And you do not have to embrace a personal faith to be a Christian Democrat, but you have to embrace the ideals.
Right.
That's in our context where we are at. So.
Well, but this context is not different from the context of Paraguay, Chile, right now, United States. I don't think it's unique. Perhaps, I've never been in Sweden, but I think perhaps it's more profound, but not for much. I think secularism is worldwide view of this world. Is almost what I call the worldview. And so the challenge here is that how then we go about and propose this Christian democratic view in a world which doesn't believe in the foundation of what we believe. We are a different worldview. I agree with that. So the question is, I think, and something to be review, if you will, of what Benedict XVI said once. There is a emergency here to educate the new generation. This is an emergency. How then we go about and educate the new generations so that they can embrace, and then we can go together and act together. So the question then, how then we do that? And I think it's a question of what we would call a method. What is the way by which we can announce people? That's a very complex question, but to say something very quickly, the best way to persuade someone that this way is more human is witnessing.
Yes.
We need good witness. We need people who really believe in what we are talking about here, that move forward and propose these ideas, and so are so compelling, so beautiful, and so good. People are going to ask questions about that. And let me say something even from a personalist perspective. We personalists believe that reality is the same for all of us, for everyone. Secularist, not secularist, believer, non-believer, it's the same. We live in the same world. Now, what happened is that reality has different levels or layers, if you will. And most of us live on the what we call biological level. In other words, what is biology? Well, the flesh. So economic policy are based on what? Mere economics. We care about inflation. We care about production of goods. And so we move in this level, which is the same as any other non-human animal. Now, is that the level of a human person? My answer is no. It's not yet. It's part of it. Only when you see someone who, instead of caring too much, I'm not saying it's not important, the material aspect or good. When you see someone caring about someone without looking at material good, you say, well, what is that? How this person is acting in that way? And then you are open to a second level, which is freedom, but freedom according not to your own instinct. Way that you want to survive is just giving to another because the other is your sister or your brother. And then you move to an ethos. You are more human. And that open to a world of values, the value of beauty, the value of justice. And then you can even go further than that, great ideals. In other words, society need to rediscover, or every one of us need to rediscover the level of reality which is out there. But we need someone to make us aware of that. Keep in mind just one thing, always tell my students, I have in front of me many books. One of them I think I use very often is Plato's Republic. Now, the book is a thing, it's an object. Is that is on my table. Only, which means level biological. I'm used as a, I don't know, as a, to show people. But when I open and I start reading what is written there, then I act creatively. And thanks to my interpretation, even though maybe not accurate, or that teaching, so to speak, come alive. And only when the students see that it's not that, it's not a thing, it's not an object, it's a subject come alive through an encounter with the teacher, say, well, here there is something that I can learn from my own life. And then I start moving and moving. So I understand the secularism particularly move in a very materialistic first floor, so to speak.
Mm-hmm.
And they are missing the greatness of what a human person is and can do. Now, if we can announce or propose this way of understanding reality, slowly, ultimately, you will see people reaching to what is the source of this strength, this encounter. And then you get into the mystery of God.
Yes.
It's not imposing, it's just helping people to rediscover who they are as human person. And I think that's at least human is what I do.
Yes, and that is the level that you're talking about. When you start caring about people without thinking about material gain, then you are in the area of solidarity in the way that it's expressed both in the Bible and in the tradition of Christian democracy, which is a form of brotherly love, but you're not looking at what class or what you can gain in that way, but just because it's another person.
Right, right. Because solidarity in the Christian tradition has a very unique meaning. Solidarity is a virtue. It's a strength that comes from what? When I overcome my tendencies, which incline me to keep everything to myself, self-interest. When I just overcome that and I help another, then I'm using certain strength that ultimately benefit me, not only the person to whom I'm helping, the other also help me, because when you move from the biological level, the reality is what we call reversible. In other words, I give, but I receive. So if society is built on that, then many things will be easier. Now, remember just one teaching. I think is very compelling. And Maritain repeated this quite often. But he got from Aristotle. What is one of perhaps the fundamental ingredient of political life? He said, friendship.
Yes.
The encounter of a friend. Maritain said civic friendship. Now, our society, because it's based on this biological view, is based on perhaps Carl Schmitt, enemies and friends, and so this dichotomy. In other words, we are in struggle for power instead of building society in friendship. Even though friendship doesn't mean uniformity, homogeneity, it means we recognize the humanity in one another, and then we exchange views in order to build a common good.
Yes. I often repeat this when I teach about Christian democracy and ideology, this friendship, because we live in a world where politics is being polarized, and you are seeking to at least talk about your opponent as an enemy instead of another person also wanting to do something for society, but perhaps has a different view. I long for a society where we will try to recognize that you are also trying to do good. Let's talk about how is your idea and how is my idea, and actually view each other as friends, perhaps cousins.
Right,
Yeah.
right. And perhaps a part of this secularistic idea, and I see that the most harmful idea is how this biological level, I will insist on that, see freedom. Freedom seems to be freedom from constraint. It's negative freedom. So if that is the case, society only should establish the structure that allow me to do whatever I want. Is me the source of all goodness. So, because the assumption in this view is that there is a impossibility of reconcile a norm and freedom. And I would say yes, if you understand your own humanity and society as strictly material, biological. Of course, at that level, if I leave my little dog free, she's going to move around without any constraint. But that freedom is freedom strictly from what? From certain biological constraint. And so, but when you move and rediscover who you are and see that you can build your own humanity, not only by doing what you want, but by doing what you ought, you respond to who you are as person. And then you see that there are certain norms in your, let's say, in your human nature. Then that normative structure, human normative structure, make us live freer or more free life. Yes. It's like playing the piano. One can sit down in front of the piano and not use the partiture. Well, good luck. But if you follow strictly the notes written by Bach, then you have a beautiful symphony because you are obeying certain norms of reality. The same with our society. Now, the idea of freedom today is completely playing the piano how you wish, and then you're going to get a good song. It's not happening because you are betraying something in reality which is proper to us, that we are human person, and we are freer when we obey ourselves and our own, not only biological dimensions, psychological, emotional, spiritual.
And this is beautiful to me to listen to, because I also talked with our Nestor in the party just the other week. He was the party leader for a long time, and many people look up to him because he was a man of values and ethics, and he talked about freedom having to have some constraints to actually allow us to be free. And so here you developed this. Is just a week ago I talked to him, and this is just beautiful. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Yes, I wanted also to ask you, how do you see the Christian democratic movement in Latin America? Does it have a future? Is it active anywhere, or where is it at now?
Well, it's a good question, but I'm going to remind you something that I always remind my students. I'm a philosopher, not a prophet.
No.
I don't know what may happen. But this is what I know. The Christian democratic movement is in crisis. There's no question about that. In other words, the golden age has long passed. Golden age, I mean the age of Frei, Caldera, and some others, which you can point out as the decade of the 1960s, 70s, perhaps Caldera even the 90s. And also the ideas that was even pushed a little bit or enriched by some of the documents coming out of the Vatican II, the Council. Then began a long decline, and there are many factors of that decline or decadence, so to speak. Some ideological ideas which were somehow getting into the view of Christian democracy, make Christian democracy start losing its own identity, and just people join the Democratic Party for power, and so that's human, human part of the human condition. So that golden age, I think, is gone. Today, in different parts, if you say, well, Venezuela was originally one of the most important places, it's almost non-existent as a political uh, power or political party. Well, Venezuela is a unique case, it's a strong dictatorship coming from the Chavez era, so no political party, really free party, can participate as such. So this in Chile is a different case, but yes, there was some flourishment, if you will, after the Pinochet resignation, with Patricio Aylwin first, and then Eduardo Frei, the son of the president. But then also began a decline in not only acceptance from the electorate, but the ideas start changing. And many of them, as start somehow becoming more with less identity, particularly in something that is, I think, is proper to a Christian Democratic Party, which is what may call the values.
Yes.
I'm not talking about here the economics or social policy, are the values. When the values start somehow getting weaker, then the reason why the Christian Democratic is there disappear. There's no proposal. Because if you just take out the values and you only trust on political, in economics, so to speak, well, political economy of Christian Democratic Party is almost at least close. So why then I should choose Christian democracy? So there something there which is need to be reestablished. So we are at that juncture. In other words, going back to your observation about secularization or secularism, the secularism of our age is also affecting profoundly, I think, to the Christian democratic movement in Latin America. With all the other issues, which are more proper to the continent, which is economic issue, and poverty and the like, inequality and so on. But unless we recover the original message, the original proposal,
yes,
unless there is a group of people who make the new birth, so to speak, and give new sap, new life, energy, is going to be hard to create a strong democratic movement only by resorting to politics. That's not enough. I think politics work only if there is life behind that.
Yes, I hold very strongly to the values of Christian democracy, and this is sort of my mission, why I am talking to people all around the world, trying to have a revival for the values and for the ideas, and then I let other people do politics of them. And this conversation with you today has been extraordinary, and I thank you so much for agreeing to talk with me.
You're welcome. One thing, everything, and I agree with that, with Aristotle, everything begins with friendship. I have a picture, it's a painting behind me, you can see, I don't know, barely you can see. It's a picture of, or painting of Jacques Maritain with Dorothy Day. Dorothy Day was the activist, the Catholic activist in 1940 in the United States. And so it's a very historical picture. And there were a few activists there with them. And so they used to get together, particularly in the 1940s when the war was raging in Europe. And they were building friendships so that they could help France to begin anew after they hope that they would defeat the Nazis. Eventually, that would happen, and they were very close to the goal. And so, and I think that's what we are. I think at this point, begin with small groups, in order that the fire of these ideals still can illuminate the rest of society.
Yes. Thank you so much. Let's do this together and illuminate society. Thank you for talking with me today.
Thank you very much.